The cold winter wind carried a whisper of desperation across Brimstone Creek, Arizona Territory. 1877. Zachary Young tightened his grip on the reins of his chestnut mare as they trudged through the muddy Main Street, the distant mountains looming like silent judges against the setting sun. He had been riding for 3 days straight, his body aching and his soul weary from the memories of the war that still haunted him 12 years after its end. The town appeared before him like a mirage in the desert, a collection of weathered buildings, the promise of a hot meal, and perhaps a night where the nightmares would stay at bay. The painted sign of the Silver Dollar Saloon swung on rusty hinges, creaking with each gust of wind. It was there, huddled against the rough-hewn wall, that he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 25, her thin frame wrapped in a tattered shawl that did little to keep out the bitter cold. Her honey blonde hair hung in limp strands around a face that spoke of better days long past. She held out a trembling hand to passers-by who either ignored her completely or tossed contemptuous glances her way. Zachary drew his horse to a halt, watching as the young woman's eyes followed a pair of boots tossing a few coins into the dust before her. Something in her demeanor, a quiet dignity despite her circumstances, stirred something long dormant in his chest. He dismounted slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his knee, a souvenir from Antietam. The woman didn't look up as his shadow fell across her. Her gaze remained fixed on the worn leather of her once fine boots. Zachary removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing a shock of dark hair threaded with premature silver at his temples. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice gentle but clear against the cacophony of piano music and raucous laughter spilling from the saloon. "Might I ask your name?" Her head lifted slowly, wariness evident in eyes the color of summer sage. She studied him for a long moment, as if determining whether he was worth the breath it would take to answer. Finally, her cracked lips parted. Zara Gardner, Miss Gardner," he said, giving a slight nod. "I'm Zachary Young. Might I buy you a proper meal?" Suspicion clouded her features. "And what would you be wanting in return, Mr. Young?" "Just conversation," he replied honestly. "I've been riding alone for too long, and a friendly face across the table would be welcome." Zara's laugh was as dry as the desert surrounding them. "Friendly faces come cheaper inside the saloon, Mr. Young. I'm not looking for that kind of company," he said firmly, extending his hand. "Just supper and maybe a story of how you came to be here." She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the saloon doors where a burly man had appeared, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her talking to Zachary. A flash of fear crossed her face. "That offer," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'll take it now." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her fingers were ice-cold against his calloused palm, and she swayed slightly as she stood. Up close, Zachary could see the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes, the hollowness of her cheeks speaking of too many missed meals. "You have a place where we can talk without prying eyes?" she asked, glancing nervously toward the saloon again. Zachary followed her gaze, noting the man who was now making his way toward them, pushing past the batwing doors with determined strides. "Trouble? You could say that," she murmured, her body tensing beside him. He made a quick decision, leading her toward his horse. "We'll find somewhere quiet." He helped her mount before swinging up behind her, acutely aware of how little she weighed against him. With a click of his tongue, he guided the mare away from the saloon, feeling Zara's body gradually relax as they put distance between themselves and the man who had caused such alarm. They found a small boarding house on the edge of town, its weathered sign promising clean rooms and hot meals. The elderly proprietress, Mrs. Abernathy, eyed them suspiciously, until Zachary explained they would need 2 separate rooms and would be grateful for whatever food she could provide. "Got stew and cornbread," she said gruffly. 5 cents extra for coffee." "That would be fine, madam," Zachary replied, placing a silver dollar on the counter. "And perhaps some hot water for washing up." Mrs. Abernathy's weathered face softened slightly at his politeness. "I'll have my boy bring it up. Rooms are at the top of the stairs, last 2 on the right." They ate in the small dining room, empty save for a traveling salesman dozing in the corner. Zara ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, sopping up every last bit of gravy with her cornbread. Zachary waited patiently, sipping his coffee and watching as color gradually returned to her cheeks. "You're not from around here," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "No, madam. I've been drifting since the war." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask which side he'd fought for. Some questions were better left unasked in these still healing territories. "And what brings you to Brimstone Creek? Not exactly on the way to anywhere important." Zachary stared into his coffee cup. "I heard there might be work at the silver mine outside of town. Or with the cattle drive coming through next month." Zara's eyes flickered with something like disappointment. "So you're just passing through?" "Most likely," he agreed, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "And you, what's your story, Miss Gardner?" She was silent for a long moment, tracing the rim of her cup with one slender finger. "I came west with my husband 3 years ago. He had dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines." A bitter smile touched her lips. "All he struck was the bottom of a whiskey bottle and eventually the wrong end of a miner's temper." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zachary said quietly. Zara's laugh held no humor. "Don't be. Thomas was a cruel man long before he was a dead one." She looked up, her eyes suddenly vulnerable. "The man at the saloon, Russell Thorne, he owns half the businesses in town, including the mine. Thomas owed him money when he died. Thorne says the debt falls to me now." Understanding dawned on Zachary. "And he's offered you a way to pay it off." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I've been working in the laundry, but it's not enough. Thorne gave me until the end of the week to either pay up or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "How much do you owe?" $50, she said, the sum hanging between them like an impossible chasm. Zachary whistled low. It might as well have been 500 to someone in her position. "And you've been begging to make up the difference." "I've been trying to save enough to get out of town," she corrected him. "There's nothing for me here but Thorne's debt and Thorne's saloon girls." They fell into silence, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional snore from the traveling salesman. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes and carrying the distant howl of a coyote. "Get some rest, Miss Gardner," Zachary said finally, rising from his chair. "We can talk more in the morning." She looked up at him, weariness and wariness battling in her gaze. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Young? You don't know me from Eve." He considered her question seriously. "Maybe I'm tired of riding alone," he said at last. "Or maybe I just don't like men who prey on widows." He tipped his hat. "Either way, you're safe for tonight. That's what matters." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Zach," she said softly, using the diminutive as if testing it on her tongue. "Thank you." He nodded once and made his way upstairs, his thoughts more tangled than they had been in years. Morning came with the soft golden light of dawn filtering through thin curtains. Zachary had slept poorly, his dreams populated by the faces of men he'd killed and the new face of a woman with sage green eyes. He rose early, washed in the cold water left in the basin, and headed downstairs to find Zara already seated at a table, a steaming cup of coffee before her. She looked different in the morning light, still thin and wary, but somehow stronger, more determined. She had washed her hair, which now hung in damp waves past her shoulders, and had mended a tear in her simple dress. "You're up early," he remarked, sliding into the chair across from her. "Old habits," she replied. "The laundry opens at dawn." "You're going back there today," she nodded. "I still need to earn my keep, Mr. Young. Your kindness last night doesn't change that." "Call me Zach," he said, "and I might have a proposition for you." Wariness immediately returned to her eyes. "I told you, not that kind," he interrupted gently. "I'm heading to Castle Dome next. It's a mining town about 3 days' ride from here, but I've heard they're building it up proper. They'll need all sorts of skills there, including laundry." Hope flickered briefly in her eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. "And Thorne, he'll come looking for his money." "Let me worry about Thorne," Zachary said, an idea forming in his mind. "I need to check in at the mine anyway, see about that work." Zara studied him for a long moment. "Why would you do this for me?" It was a fair question, one he wasn't entirely sure he had an answer for. There was something about her, a resilience beneath the fragility that called to him. Or perhaps it was simply that helping her gave purpose to his aimless wandering. "Let's just say I've seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes," he said finally. "If I can prevent a bit more, why wouldn't I?" She didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded slowly. "I need to collect my things from my room in town. It's not much, but—" "I'll go with you," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "After breakfast." Zara's room, as it turned out, was little more than a closet above the laundry where she worked, accessible only by an exterior staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. Inside, the space was painfully neat: a narrow cot, a small trunk at its foot, and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. A faded daguerreotype of a solemn-faced couple sat on a makeshift shelf, the only personal touch in the Spartan room. "My parents," Zara explained, following his gaze as she quickly gathered her few belongings. "They died of fever when I was 16. Thomas was my father's apprentice in the blacksmith shop. He offered marriage, and I had nowhere else to go." She carefully wrapped the photograph in a scrap of cloth before placing it in the trunk. "Not the wisest decision I ever made." "You were young," Zachary said, keeping watch through the grimy window. "We all make choices we regret." She paused in her packing, looking at him curiously. "And what do you regret?" Zach Young. Before he could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on the staircase caught their attention. Zachary moved swiftly to the door, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip. The door burst open to reveal Russell Thorne, his broad frame filling the doorway, a silver watch dangling from his meaty fingers. "Time's up, Mrs. Gardner," he drawled, then stopped short at the sight of Zachary. His eyes narrowed. "You're the fella from yesterday." "Mr. Thorne," Zachary acknowledged calmly. "Miss Gardner is coming with me to Castle Dome. Any business you have with her can be conducted through me from now on." Thorne's laugh was ugly. "That's not how this works, Cowboy. The lady owes me money, and I aim to collect one way or another." His gaze slid to Zara, who had gone very still. "Unless you're planning to pay her debts, how about we discuss this like gentlemen?" Zachary suggested, his voice deceptively mild. "Perhaps over a drink at your establishment." Thorne considered him for a moment, greed warring with suspicion in his small eyes. Finally, he stepped back. "1 hour. My office behind the saloon." His gaze returned to Zara. "Don't get any ideas about leaving town, Mrs. Gardner. I'd hate to have to send the boys after you." With that parting threat, he descended the stairs, each step deliberate and heavy. When he was gone, Zara released a shaky breath. "He won't let me go, Zach, not without his money." "Then I'll give him his money," Zachary said simply, her eyes widened. "You can't." "That's an outrageous sum." "I have it," he interrupted. I've been saving my earnings from odd jobs for nearly 2 years. Was going to buy a small piece of land somewhere, settle down." He smiled slightly. "Helping you seems a better use for it right now." Zara shook her head, disbelief written across her features. "You'd give up your dreams for a stranger." "Dreams change," he said with a shrug, "and you're not quite a stranger anymore." She finished packing in silence, her movements more hurried now. As they descended the stairs, trunk in hand, Zachary noticed her glancing back at the small room with an unreadable expression. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "No," she said firmly. "Just wondering how something so small could feel like a prison for so long." The Silver Dollar Saloon was quieter in the daylight hours, populated by a few early drinkers nursing their glasses at scattered tables. A piano player half-heartedly tapped out a tune in the corner, while a bored-looking woman in a gaudy dress leaned against the bar, eyeing the newcomers with mild interest. Thorne's office was a surprisingly elegant space that stood in stark contrast to the rough saloon it adjoined. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and ledgers. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not with books but with bottles of fine liquor, their amber contents catching the light from the window. Thorne himself sat behind the desk, a cigar clenched between his teeth, watching as Zachary entered alone. Zara had agreed to wait with their belongings at the boarding house. "So," Thorne said, removing the cigar and tapping ash into a silver tray, "what's your interest in the widow Gardner?" "I'm offering her employment," Zachary replied, remaining standing despite Thorne's gesture toward a chair. "As my housekeeper." Thorne's eyebrows rose. "Housekeeper, is it? And do you have a house, Mr. Young?" "Zachary Young, and I will in Castle Dome." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I understand Mrs. Gardner's debt to you stands at $50. Thorne leaned forward, sudden interest sharpening his gaze. "That's right. Her husband borrowed against future earnings at the mine. Unfortunately, he died before producing anything of value." His smile was cold. "Tragic, really." "Indeed," Zachary said dryly, counting out $50 in gold coins onto the desk. "I believe this settles the account in full." Thorne made no move to touch the money, instead studying Zachary with newfound curiosity. "You must want her services quite badly to pay such a sum." "What I want," Zachary said evenly, "is a receipt indicating that all debts are paid and that you relinquish any claim on Mrs. Gardner's time or person." A slow smile spread across Thorne's face. "You're a cautious man, Mr. Young. I can respect that." He pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer and dipped a pen in an inkwell, scrawling a few lines before signing with a flourish. He sprinkled sand over the wet ink, then blew it away. "There. Mrs. Gardner is free and clear." Zachary took the paper, scanning its contents before folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Thorne." "One moment," Thorne said as Zachary turned to leave. "A word of advice from one businessman to another." He gestured toward the window, through which the dusty Main Street was visible. "Brimstone Creek isn't the only place where a man's debts follow him or her. If you're truly bound for Castle Dome, you might find the welcome chillier than expected." "Is that a threat, Mr. Thorne?" "Just an observation," Thorne replied, picking up his cigar again. "This territory is smaller than it seems. Word travels." Zachary nodded once. "So does reputation, Mr. Thorne. I'd hate for word to travel about how you treat widows in your town." He left without waiting for a response, stepping back into the saloon where the piano player had switched to a livelier tune. One of the saloon girls approached him, swaying her hips suggestively. "Looking for company, handsome?" she asked, her painted lips curved in a practiced smile. "Not today," he replied, tipping his hat politely as he made his way to the door. Outside, the day had warmed considerably, the winter sun high in a cloudless sky. Zachary paused on the boardwalk, surveying the town that seemed somehow smaller and shabbier in the harsh light of day. A group of miners trudged toward the saloon, their faces gray with dust and exhaustion. An old Native American man sat cross-legged beside the general store, selling beaded jewelry that no one stopped to examine. This was what passed for civilization in the territories, a precarious balance of commerce, vice, and survival, with fortunes won and lost on the turn of a card or the swing of a pickaxe. Zachary had seen dozens of such towns since leaving Tennessee after the war, each one promising riches or redemption, each one ultimately disappointing. Yet something felt different this time as he made his way back to the boarding house where Zara waited. Perhaps it was the weight of the receipt in his pocket, or the prospect of a journey with a companion rather than another solitary ride across hostile country. Whatever it was, it felt uncomfortably like hope and emotion Zachary had long since learned to mistrust. Zara was sitting on the porch of the boarding house, her trunk at her feet when he arrived. She rose quickly at his approach, her expression anxious. "Well?" she asked without preamble. In response, he handed her the receipt. She read it once, then again, her fingers trembling slightly. "You actually did it," she whispered, looking up at him with something like wonder. "I'm free. Free to come to Castle Dome," Zachary confirmed, lifting her trunk effortlessly. "We should get moving if we want to make good distance before nightfall." They set out within the hour, Zachary leading his mare with Zara perched atop her, the trunk secured behind the saddle. He walked alongside, preferring to stretch his legs after the ride into town. The road leading out of Brimstone Creek was little more than a rutted trail, winding through scrubland dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stunted juniper. "Have you been to Castle Dome before?" Zara asked as they left the last outlying buildings behind. "Passed through about a year ago," Zachary replied. "It was barely more than a tent city then, but I hear the silver strike has brought proper investment. They're building a school, even a small church." Zara's eyes brightened at this news. "A proper town, then, with decent folk." "Some decent, some not," Zachary said honestly. "Same as anywhere, but it's a fresh start." She fell silent for a while, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that seemed to hover on the horizon, never growing closer despite hours of travel. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer. "Why are you really helping me, Zach? And don't say it's because you're tired of riding alone. There are easier traveling companions to find." He considered his answer carefully, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. "During the war," he began slowly, "I saw men at their worst. Did things I'm not proud of, all in the name of a cause I wasn't sure I believed in anymore by the end." He glanced up at her. "After it was over, I promised myself I'd try to balance the scales somehow, do some good to offset the harm. And I'm your good deed." There was no bitterness in her question, only curiosity. "You're a person who needed help that I could give," he corrected gently. "The why of it doesn't much matter, does it?" She studied him with those sage green eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "I suppose not," she conceded. "But thank you all the same." They made camp that night beneath a solitary cottonwood tree beside a small stream. Zachary built a fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, supplemented with hardtack that he softened in his coffee. Zara watched him work with undisguised interest. "You've done this before," she observed as he efficiently set up their camp. "More nights than I can count," he agreed, stirring the beans in their small pot. "Been on the move since '65. 12 years, she said softly. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" The constant moving. He poured her a cup of coffee, considering her question. Sometimes, but staying in one place has its own kind of weariness. He passed her a plate of food. What about you? Did you never think of leaving Brimstone Creek before now? Zara accepted the plate, balancing it carefully on her lap. Every day, but where would I go? A woman alone doesn't have many options in these territories. She took a small bite, chewing thoughtfully. Besides, there was the debt. Thorne made it clear what would happen if I tried to run. And now I'm terrified, she admitted with a small laugh. But it's a good kind of terror, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. Zachary nodded, understanding precisely what she meant. He'd felt that same exhilarating fear when he'd first headed west, leaving behind the ruins of his former life. Castle Dome is just the beginning, he said. Once we get there, you can decide what comes next. And you, she asked, her gaze direct in the firelight. What comes next for Zachary Young? It was a question he had deliberately avoided asking himself for years. I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. She seemed to accept this, turning her attention back to her meal. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the soft murmur of the stream and the distant call of night birds. When they had finished, Zachary insisted she take his bedroll while he kept watch. There are coyotes in these hills, he explained, and sometimes two-legged predators as well. Zara didn't argue, exhaustion evident in the droop of her shoulders. She settled into his bedroll, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Zach, she said, her voice already heavy with approaching sleep. I don't think I've thanked you properly. No need, he replied, feeding another stick to the fire. Get some rest. He watched as she drifted off, her breathing becoming deep and even. In sleep, the lines of worry eased from her face, making her look younger, almost girlish. Zachary felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness, followed by a pang of something like longing. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to care about another person's welfare. The night passed without incident, and they set out again at dawn, this time with Zara walking alongside him for stretches while the horse carried their belongings. She proved to be a good traveler, uncomplaining despite the harsh conditions, and seemingly content with the sparse conversation that punctuated their journey. By the third day, the landscape had changed, becoming more rugged as they approached the mountain range that sheltered Castle Dome. The trail wound through narrow canyons where their voices echoed strangely, and the shadows seemed to hold watchful presences. It's beautiful, Zara remarked as they paused to rest beside a clear pool formed by a small waterfall. In a wild, untamed sort of way. Zachary nodded, refilling their canteens. Different from Tennessee, he said. Greener there, more gentle somehow. You miss it, she observed. Parts of it, he admitted. The smell of pine forests after rain, the way fog hangs in the valleys at dawn. He capped the canteens. But there was nothing left for me there after the war. No family. My parents died before the war. My brother fell at Chickamauga. He said this matter-of-factly, the old grief long since dulled to a familiar ache. What about you? Any family besides your parents? Zara shook her head. I was their only child. A miracle baby, they called me. My mother had lost 3 before me. She dipped her fingers in the cool water, watching the ripples spread outward. I always thought I'd have a big family of my own someday to make up for being an only child. And now. She withdrew her hand, wiping it dry on her skirt. Now I know that children need more than dreams to thrive. They need security, stability. A shadow crossed her face. Things I couldn't provide. Zachary wanted to tell her that those things were still possible, that the future remained unwritten, but he held his tongue. False promises were crueler than honest silence. They reached Castle Dome late the following afternoon. cresting a rise to find the town spread before them in the valley below. It had indeed grown since Zachary's last visit. What had been a haphazard collection of tents and crude shelters was now a proper settlement with straight streets and solid buildings. The silver mine that had spawned the town was visible on the mountainside to the north, its entrance a dark wound in the rocky slope. "It's bigger than I expected," Zara said, shielding her eyes against the setting sun. "Look, there's the church you mentioned." Indeed, a white steeple rose above the other buildings, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. Nearby stood a two-story structure that could only be the school, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon light. "What do you think?" Zachary asked, watching her face closely. "I think," she said slowly, "that this might be a place where a person could start over." They made their way down into the town, drawing curious glances from the residents they passed. Castle Dome had the bustling energy of a place on the rise. Wagons loaded with ore rumbled through the streets. Storekeepers arranged displays in new windows, and construction continued on several buildings despite the late hour. Zachary led them to a modest boarding house on the edge of town, its fresh paint and tidy porch a testament to its relative newness. A sign above the door proclaimed it, "The Pioneer Rest Clean Rooms, Fair Prices." The proprietress, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes, introduced herself as Mrs. Holloway. She showed them to two adjoining rooms on the second floor, explaining that meals were served in the dining room downstairs, and that laundry facilities were available for an extra fee. "You two just passing through?" she asked, her gaze moving assessingly between them. "Actually, we're looking to settle," Zachary replied. "I heard there might be work available in town." Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Mine's always hiring, though it's dangerous work. The Graham Ranch outside town needs hands too." She turned to Zara. "As for you, miss, the assay office is looking for someone who can write a fair hand, and Dr. Wilson's been advertising for a nurse's assistant." Zara's eyes widened slightly at these unexpected possibilities. "Thank you. I'll inquire tomorrow." When Mrs. Holloway had gone, Zara turned to Zachary with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "You never mentioned I might find proper employment here." "I wasn't sure what would be available," he said honestly, "but Castle Dome is growing fast. New towns need all sorts of skills." She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, suddenly looking overwhelmed. "It's happening so quickly. 3 days ago I was begging outside a saloon, certain I'd end up." She didn't finish the thought. "And now I'm here with options I never dreamed of." "Life can change in an instant," Zachary said, leaning against the doorframe. "For better or worse." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "What will you do now? Will you stay in Castle Dome too?" It was a question he had been asking himself throughout their journey. The original plan, find work, earn enough to move on, seemed less appealing than it had before meeting Zara. "For a while," he said finally. "At least until I know you're settled." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Thank you for bringing me here, Zach. Whatever happens next, I won't forget what you've done." There was a finality to her words that troubled him, as if she were already preparing for their paths to diverge. He found himself strangely reluctant to let the conversation end. "Would you join me for supper? Mrs. Holloway mentioned they serve until 8. "I'd like that," she said with a small smile. "Just give me a few minutes to freshen up." Downstairs, the dining room was half full with other boarders and a few locals who apparently came for the food alone. Mrs. Holloway herself served them a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that put their trail rations to shame. Zachary watched with pleasure as Zara ate with obvious enjoyment, color returning to her cheeks with each passing day away from Brimstone Creek. "Tell me about yourself," she said between bites. Not the war, not your travels. Tell me about the boy you were before all that. The request caught him off guard. It had been so long since he had thought of that earlier self that he almost couldn't recall him. I was a quiet child, he said slowly. Always had my nose in a book when I wasn't helping my father with the horses. He trained them for wealthy planters, had a way with even the most spirited colts. Did he teach you? Everything I know about horses, Zachary confirmed. Said I had the touch too, though I never believed I was as good as him. A memory surfaced, bringing an unexpected smile. When I was 12, he let me help deliver a foal, a beautiful black filly with a white star on her forehead. Called her Midnight Star. She was mine to raise and train. What happened to her? Zara asked, then immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry, that was thoughtless. No, it's all right, he assured her. She survived the war, actually. I left her with neighbors when I enlisted. Last I heard, she was still alive, though getting on in years now. Zara's face softened. That's good to know. That's something from before survived. They continued talking long after their plates were cleared, sharing fragments of their past lives, her father's skill at crafting ornate metalwork, his mother's prized peach preserves, her childhood dream of becoming a schoolteacher, his first hunting trip with his brother. It was the longest conversation Zachary had engaged in for years, and he found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of being known, even in this small way. When they finally returned to their rooms, the night well advanced, Zachary felt a curious reluctance to bid her good night. They paused in the hallway between their doors, the moment stretching between them. What time shall we start inquiring about work tomorrow? Zara asked, her hand resting on her doorknob. No rush, Zachary replied. We've had a long journey. Perhaps we should take a day to rest and explore the town. She nodded, relief evident in her expression. I'd like that. She hesitated, then added softly, Good night, Zach. Sleep well. Good night, Zara. He watched as she disappeared into her room before entering his own, struck by how quickly her presence had become a comfort rather than a responsibility. It was a dangerous feeling. He knew attachment led to pain more often than not in his experience. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision that had brought them here, to this new beginning in Castle Dome. The next day dawned clear and cold, the desert air crystalline in its purity. After breakfast, they set out to explore the town. Zara's arm linked casually through Zachary's as they strolled along the main street. Castle Dome was indeed prospering. The general store boasted goods that would have been considered luxuries in smaller settlements. The assay office had a steady stream of miners bringing in samples, and construction continued on what would apparently be a proper hotel. It's so alive, Zara remarked as they paused to watch a group of children playing in front of the schoolhouse. Not just surviving, but growing. That's what the silver does, Zachary said. Brings money, which brings people, which brings more money. And when the silver runs out. He glanced at her, impressed by her foresight. Then it either finds another reason to exist or becomes another ghost town. I've seen both happen. They continued their exploration, stopping to inquire at the assay office where the manager, a harried man named Peterson, brightened considerably at the mention of Zara's penmanship skills. Can you handle basic arithmetic as well? He asked eagerly. My current clerk is worse than useless with figures. I kept the books for my father's blacksmith shop, Zara replied confidently, and later for my husband's mining claims. Excellent, Peterson exclaimed. When can you start? Zara glanced at Zachary, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. Tomorrow, if that suits you, she told Peterson. Perfect. 8 sharp. Wage is $2 a day, paid weekly. As they left the assay office, Zara could barely contain her excitement. $2 a day, she exclaimed. That's more than I made in a week at the laundry. You've got skills worth paying for, Zachary reminded her, and Peterson seems to recognize that. They continued to the doctor's office, where Zara left her name in case a position still opened up, then to the small newspaper office where the editor mentioned they occasionally needed help with typesetting. By mid-afternoon, they had completed a circuit of the town and found themselves at the livery stable where Zachary had left his horse that morning. The livery owner, a grizzled man named Jenkins, was shoeing a magnificent bay gelding, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. "Fine animal," Zachary commented, running an appreciative hand along the horse's flank. "Quarter horse, mixed with some thoroughbred," Jenkins replied, glancing up. "You know horses, mister. My father trained them," Zachary said. "Learned from him." Jenkins straightened, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Could use someone with that knowledge around here, getting more horses than I can handle with all the new folks coming to town." Zachary felt a surge of interest. Working with horses again, it was something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. "You offering a job, might be," Jenkins said, eyeing him assessingly. "What's your name, son?" "Zachary Young." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Young." There was a Young had a training farm near Nashville before the war, bred some of the finest saddle horses in the state. "That was my father," Zachary confirmed, surprised. "Well, I'll be damned." Jenkins extended a calloused hand. "I bought 2 mares from him in '58, best horses I ever owned." He jerked his head toward the back of the stable. "Come have a look at what I'm working with. If you've got half your father's skill, we might come to an arrangement." Zara touched Zachary's arm. "I'll wait for you in the general store," she said. "Take your time." Zachary spent the next hour with Jenkins, examining the dozen or so horses in his care and discussing training methods and bloodlines. The older man was knowledgeable and fair-minded, and by the time they finished talking, Zachary had secured a position helping with the livery's increasing business. $3 a day to start, Jenkins offered. "More if things continue to pick up, and you can use the room above the stable if you want nothing fancy, but it's private." "I appreciate the offer," Zachary said, "but I'll stay at the boarding house for now." He didn't examine too closely why the prospect of moving away from Zara seemed unappealing. When he rejoined Zara at the general store, he found her engaged in animated conversation with a young woman who was introduced as Emily Wilson, the doctor's daughter. "Miss Gardner was just telling me about her experience helping with herbal remedies," Emily explained. "Father will be thrilled to meet her. We've been overwhelmed since the influenza outbreak last month." "It's nothing formal," Zara demurred. "Just knowledge passed down from my mother." "Any knowledge is valuable here," Emily insisted. "Please do come by tomorrow after you finish at the assay office. Father works late on Tuesdays." After Emily had gone, Zachary raised an eyebrow at Zara. "Herbal remedies," she shrugged, a touch defensively. "My mother was known for her tinctures and poultices. I helped her prepare them from the time I could walk." Her expression softened. "It feels good to remember those skills. Useful. You never mentioned this before." "There wasn't much call for healing in Brimstone Creek," she said dryly. "Most folks preferred whiskey to willow bark tea for their ailments." They left the general store with a few modest purchases, a new shirt for Zachary, some hair ribbons, and a small pot of lavender-scented cream for Zara. Simple luxuries that nevertheless felt significant after the austerity of their recent circumstances. As they walked back toward the boarding house, the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Zachary found himself studying Zara's profile. She looked different already, more vibrant, more present. Castle Dome was clearly agreeing with her. "So," she said, breaking into his thoughts. "The livery stable. Jenkins knew my father," Zachary replied, still somewhat amazed by the coincidence. Offered me work starting tomorrow. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. That's wonderful, Zach. Working with horses again, that will suit you. How do you know what will suit me? He asked, genuinely curious. The way you handle your mare, she said simply. The gentleness mixed with authority. It's clear you understand them. She resumed walking, adding softly, and the way you talk about your father's horses, your voice changes, becomes warmer. Her observation struck him deeply. He hadn't realized he was so transparent or that she had been watching him so closely. It feels right, he admitted, more right than anything has in a long time. They reached the boarding house just as the dinner bell was ringing. As they entered the cozy dining room, Zachary was aware of a new sense of possibility unfurling within him, not just for Zara's future in Castle Dome, but perhaps for his own as well. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Zara worked at the assay office during the day and spent several evenings a week at the doctor's, learning more formal medical knowledge while sharing her herbal expertise. Zachary divided his time between the livery stable and occasional work with the local rancher, whose foreman had been impressed by his way with the more difficult horses. They still took their meals together at the boarding house, and on Sundays they often walked to the small church together, though Zachary would sometimes wait outside while Zara attended the service. Afterward, they would explore the surrounding countryside, gradually venturing farther from town as their confidence in the area grew. It was during one such Sunday excursion, nearly a month after their arrival in Castle Dome, that Zachary realized how thoroughly Zara had become woven into the fabric of his daily life. They had ridden to a small plateau overlooking the valley, bringing a simple picnic that they shared in companionable silence. Zara sat with her back against a sun-warmed rock, her hair loose around her shoulders, a contentment in her expression that had been absent when they first met. She had filled out a bit in the past weeks, the regular meals and reduced stress lending a healthier glow to her skin and a softness to her figure that the better-fitting clothes she could now afford only enhanced. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, catching him watching her. "Just thinking how different you look from that first night in Brimstone Creek," he replied honestly. She smiled, though a shadow crossed her face at the mention of her former home. "Different on the inside, too," she said. "I feel whole again, or maybe whole for the first time." She plucked a wildflower that grew beside her, twirling it between her fingers. "I never properly thanked you for that." "You don't need to." "I do," she interrupted gently. "You gave me more than money that day, Zach. You gave me a chance to discover who I could be without fear hanging over me." She met his gaze directly. "That's a debt I can never repay." "There is no debt between us," he said firmly. "Whatever I gave, you've returned tenfold just by." He hesitated, uncertain how to express what her presence had come to mean to him. "Just by what?" she prompted when he didn't continue. "By reminding me that connection is possible," he thought. "By showing me that the future might hold more than endless wandering. By making me want to stay." But these were dangerous thoughts, leading to expectations he had no right to impose. Instead, he said simply, "By being exactly who you are." Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for something more in his words. Whatever she found or didn't find caused her to glance away, returning her attention to the wildflower in her hand. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned that the room above the livery is still empty," she said after a moment. "Are you thinking of taking Jenkins up on his offer?" The change of subject was abrupt, but Zachary followed her lead. "I've considered it. It would be convenient, especially on days when I work late." He watched her carefully. "Would that bother you, my moving from the boarding house?" She shook her head too quickly. "Of course not. You should do what makes sense for you." She began gathering the remains of their picnic, her movements suddenly brisk and efficient. "It's getting late. We should head back." The ride back to town was quieter than usual, a subtle tension between them that hadn't been there before. Zachary wasn't entirely sure what had caused it, but he suspected it had something to do with the unspoken words that seemed to hover in the air whenever they were together these days. The truth was, he had no intention of moving to the livery stable. The thought of not seeing Zara at breakfast, of not hearing her light step in the hallway between their rooms, of not having her door just across from his, it was surprisingly painful to contemplate. But he didn't know how to explain this without revealing the growing depth of his feelings for her. As they approached the boarding house, Zachary made a decision. "I think I'll stay on here," he said casually. "The livery room lacks certain comforts, Mrs. Holloway's cooking, for one." Zara glanced at him, a hesitant smile curving her lips. "Her apple pie is worth staying for," she agreed. "Among other things," Zachary added quietly. Before Zara could respond, Mrs. Holloway herself appeared on the porch, waving to catch their attention. "Miss Gardner." "There's a gentleman here asking after you," she called. Zachary felt Zara stiffen beside him. "Who is it?" she called back. "Says his name is Thorne. Russell Thorne. Claims he's an old friend from your hometown." The color drained from Zara's face, her fingers tightening on the reins of her borrowed mare. "Zach," she whispered, fear threading through her voice. "Stay here," he said, dismounting quickly. "I'll handle this." Russell Thorne sat in the boarding-house parlor, a cup of untouched tea before him, looking distinctly out of place among the modest furnishings with his brocade vest and gold watch chain. He rose as Zachary entered, a thin smile spreading across his fleshy face. "Mr. Young," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "What a pleasant surprise." "What are you doing here, Thorne?" Zachary asked without preamble. Thorne affected a look of hurt. "Such hostility, and after I've come all this way to check on Mrs. Gardner's welfare." He settled back into his chair, adjusting his vest. "I've been in Castle Dome on business. I have interests in several mining operations in the territory and thought I'd pay a social call while in town." "Mrs. Gardner has no desire to see you," Zachary said flatly. "Her debt is paid. There's nothing more between you." "Ah, but there's where you're wrong," Thorne replied, his smile hardening. "You see, after our little transaction, I discovered some irregularities in Thomas Gardner's accounts. It seems he borrowed more than I initially calculated." He withdrew a folded paper from his pocket. "Another $75 to be precise." "That's a lie," Zachary said, his voice dangerously calm. "You provided a receipt indicating all debts were settled." "For the debts I was aware of at the time, yes." Thorne shrugged. "Business is complex, Mr. Young. Ledgers can be misplaced, entries overlooked, or fabricated when convenient," Zachary suggested coldly. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I'd be careful with accusations of fraud if I were you. I'm a respected businessman in this territory." "Who preys on widows," Zachary countered. "I wonder how respected you'd be if that became common knowledge." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of Mrs. Holloway moving about in the kitchen. "I see we understand each other," Thorne said finally. "Perhaps we can reach a more amicable arrangement." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not actually interested in Mrs. Gardner's money. My new saloon in Prescott could use someone with her attributes: pretty face, decent figure. She'd earn far more there than she ever will at that assay office." Rage surged through Zachary, hot and blinding. His hand moved of its own accord, grabbing Thorne by his silk cravat and yanking him to his feet. "You listen to me," he hissed, their faces inches apart. You come near Zara again, you so much as speak her name, and I will end you. Do you understand me?" Thorne's face had gone purple, his eyes bulging with shock and fear. He nodded frantically, clawing at Zachary's grip. Zachary released him abruptly, watching with cold satisfaction as the man staggered back, gasping for air. "The receipt you gave me specified all claims on Mrs. Gardner's time or person were relinquished," he reminded Thorne. "I have witnesses who can attest to your attempt at extortion and your proposition just now. How do you think that would play out in front of a judge? You wouldn't dare," Thorne wheezed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Try me," Zachary challenged. "Or better yet, don't. Just get on your horse and ride out of Castle Dome. Don't stop until you reach Prescott, and don't ever come back." For a long moment, Thorne seemed to weigh his options, his gaze calculating despite his disheveled state. Finally, he straightened his cravat with a trembling hand. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Young. Better men than you have tried to kill me," Zachary said evenly. "I'm still here." Something in his tone must have convinced Thorne of his seriousness, because the man collected his hat and walking stick without further protest. "This isn't over," he muttered as he moved toward the door. "Yes, it is," Zachary replied with quiet certainty. "For your sake, I hope you understand that." He watched from the porch as Thorne mounted his horse and rode away, not turning back until the man had disappeared from sight. Only then did he release the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. When he returned to where he had left Zara with the horses, he found her pacing anxiously, her face drawn with fear. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "What did he want?" Zachary considered how much to tell her. The truth would only frighten her unnecessarily. Thorne was gone, and Zachary was confident he wouldn't return. "He was bluffing," he said finally, "trying to squeeze more money out of us." I reminded him of the legal implications of his actions, and he decided discretion was the better part of valor. "He's gone?" Zara asked incredulously. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Zachary confirmed, taking the reins of her mare. "He won't bother you again." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by a more complex emotion that Zachary couldn't quite identify. "You protected me," she said softly. "Again." "I kept a promise," he corrected gently, leading the horses toward the stable. "There's a difference." She fell into step beside him, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. "What promise was that?" "The one I made to myself the moment I saw you," he thought. "To keep you safe. To see you smile again. To help you build a life worth living. That you'd have a fresh start here," he said aloud, "without shadows from Brimstone Creek following you." They walked in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the town bustling around them with the ordinary activities of a Sunday families returning from church. Shopkeepers chatting on porches, children playing in the dusty street. "Zach," Zara said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "What are we doing?" The question caught him off guard. "Right now, taking the horses back to Jenkins." "No," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "What are we doing with this?" She gestured between them. "We live in the same boarding house, take our meals together, spend our free time together. Anyone watching would think we're—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "Would that be so terrible?" Zachary asked quietly. "If people thought that," her eyes widened slightly. "That's not what I meant. We've never discussed what happens next. If you're staying in Castle Dome permanently, if I'm part of your plans or just someone you helped who now has her own path." She took a deep breath. "I need to know where I stand with you." It was the most direct she had ever been about the undefined nature of their relationship. Zachary found himself at a crossroads: continue with the careful distance he had maintained, or risk the vulnerability of admitting what she had come to mean to him. Before he could decide, a commotion up the street caught their attention. A man on horseback was riding full tilt toward them, his face grim. "Fire!" he shouted as he passed. "Fire at the mine! All able-bodied men to help!" Smoke was indeed visible now, a dark plume rising from the direction of the mine entrance on the mountainside. Already men were running toward it, some carrying buckets, others just responding to the call for aid. "I have to go," Zachary said, already untying his horse from the hitching post. "Get the horses to Jenkins and then go back to the boarding house. Stay there until I return." "I'm coming too," Zara insisted. "Dr. Wilson will need help with the injured." He wanted to argue but knew she was right. The determined set of her jaw told him it would be useless to try to dissuade her anyway. "Fine, but stay with the doctor. Promise me you won't go near the fire itself." She nodded, already mounting her mare again. "I promise. Be careful, Zach." He swung into his saddle, their earlier conversation necessarily set aside. "You too." The scene at the mine was chaotic. Smoke billowed from the main shaft, and men were frantically passing buckets of water from a nearby stream. "Doctor." Wilson had already established a makeshift aid station where several miners lay on blankets, some coughing violently, others with visible burns. Zachary quickly tied his horse and joined the bucket line, while Zara hurried to assist the doctor. The work was grueling. The smoke burned his lungs, the heat from the fire was intense, and the water seemed to have little effect on the flames deep within the mine shaft. "There are still men trapped inside," someone shouted. "At least 3, maybe more." Without hesitation, Zachary stepped out of the bucket line and approached the mine entrance, tying a wet bandana around his face. "Young, what do you think you're doing?" It was Peterson from the assay office, his usually immaculate suit covered in soot. "Going in after them," Zachary replied, already moving toward the shaft. "It's too dangerous. The support beams could collapse any minute." But Zachary was already entering the smoky darkness, guided only by the shouts and cries he could hear deeper within the mine. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with dust and smoke that made his eyes water. He moved carefully, aware that a wrong step could send him plunging into unseen depths. "Hello," he called. "Anyone there? Call out if you can hear me." A weak voice responded from somewhere to his left. Following the sound, Zachary found a young miner, barely more than a boy, pinned beneath a fallen timber. His face was streaked with soot, his breathing labored. "Hold on," Zachary said, assessing the situation quickly. "I'm going to lift this beam. When I do, I need you to pull yourself out." "Can you do that?" The boy nodded weakly. Zachary positioned himself, took a deep breath of the toxic air, and heaved with all his strength. The timber moved just enough for the boy to drag himself free, whimpering with pain as he did so. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it's broken." "I'll help you," Zachary assured him, stooping to lift the boy onto his back. "Put your arms around my neck. Hold tight." The journey back to the mine entrance was agonizingly slow, the weight of the injured boy making each step a struggle in the increasingly unstable tunnel. Twice, Zachary had to stop as coughing fits overtook him, the smoke filling his lungs with each labored breath. When they finally emerged into the late afternoon sun, a ragged cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. "Doctor." Wilson rushed forward to take the injured boy, and Zachary turned immediately back toward the mine. "There are others still in there," he said hoarsely to the men who tried to stop him. "I heard them calling." Before anyone could argue, he plunged back into the smoke-filled shaft, this time with 2 other volunteers following at his insistence. They moved deeper into the mine, the air growing hotter and more toxic with each step. The sounds of groaning timber surrounded them, the mine itself seeming to protest their presence. They found two more miners, one unconscious, one with severe burns across his back where his shirt had caught fire. Together, the rescue party managed to get both men to safety, emerging from the mine just as a section of the roof collapsed behind them. Zachary stumbled to his knees once they were clear, his lungs burning, his vision blurring from smoke exposure. Gentle hands guided him toward the aid station, and then Zara was there, her face tight with concern as she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "You fool," she whispered, though her voice held no real anger. "You could have been killed. Had to. Try." He managed before another coughing fit overtook him. Dr. Wilson appeared with a small bottle. "Have him drink this," he instructed Zara. "It will help clear his lungs, and keep that wet cloth on his face. The cool moisture will soothe the irritation." Zara nodded, supporting Zachary's head as she held the bottle to his lips. The liquid was bitter, but he swallowed obediently, the cool cloth on his skin a blessed relief against the lingering heat of the fire. "The others?" he asked when he could speak again. "All accounted for," Zara assured him, "thanks to you and the other volunteers." Her voice broke slightly. "You saved 3 lives today, Zach." He wanted to tell her that he had merely done what anyone would do, but even that small speech was beyond him at the moment. Instead, he closed his eyes, allowing the medicine to do its work as Zara's gentle ministrations continued. The fire was eventually contained, though the mine would be closed for repairs for at least a month. As darkness fell, the injured were transported to the doctor's office or their homes, while the rest of the town began the process of cleaning up and assessing the damage. Despite Zachary's protests that he was well enough to walk, Zara insisted he ride her mare back to the boarding house while she walked alongside. "Mrs. Holloway took one look at his soot-covered form and ordered a hot bath, prepared immediately, an unusual luxury that Zachary was too exhausted to refuse. Later, clean but still weak from smoke inhalation, he sat on the edge of his bed as Zara applied a salve of her own making to the minor burns on his hands and forearms. Her touch was gentle, her concentration absolute as she worked. "You could have died today," she said quietly, not looking up from her task. "But I didn't," he replied. "This time." She finished with the salve and began wrapping his hands in clean bandages. "You didn't even hesitate, did you? You just ran straight into danger." "They needed help," he said simply. She secured the bandage with a small knot, then finally met his gaze. "Why is it so easy for you to risk yourself for others, even strangers?" It was a question that cut closer to his core than she could possibly know. "Maybe because I spent too many years taking lives instead of saving them," he said softly. "There's a balance to be restored." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The war," he nodded, too tired to maintain the careful barriers he usually kept around those memories. "I was a sharpshooter. Good at it too good." He stared at his bandaged hands. "I stopped counting after 50 men fell to my rifle, told myself it was duty, not murder, but their faces still come to me in dreams." Zara was silent for a long moment, absorbing this confession. Then she reached out and gently tilted his face up to meet her gaze. "Listen to me, Zachary Young. Whatever you did in the war, whatever lives you took, you've more than balanced those scales. You've saved lives too, mine included." He tried to look away, but she wouldn't let him. "The past is the past," she continued firmly. "What matters is who you choose to be now, and the man I've come to." She hesitated, then finished. "The man I've come to care for deeply is someone any of those men would be proud to know." Her words penetrated the fog of exhaustion and self-recrimination that had clouded his mind for so long. "Zara," he began, unsure what he wanted to say but needing to say something. She shook her head, suddenly self-conscious. "You need to rest. she said, rising from the bed. "Doctor, Wilson said you should sleep as much as possible. The medicine might make you drowsy." Indeed, Zachary could feel fatigue pulling at him, the events of the day and the doctor's concoction combining to make his eyelids heavy. "Stay," he murmured, catching her hand with his bandaged one. "Just until I fall asleep." She hesitated, then nodded, settling back onto the edge of the bed. "I'll stay," she promised. As he drifted toward sleep, Zachary was aware of her hand still held in his, of the soft sound of her breathing, of the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. His last conscious thought was that he had never felt so at peace, so at home, as he did in that moment. When he awoke the next morning, she was gone, but a note on his bedside table informed him that she had gone to work at the assay office and would check on him at noon. Mrs. Holloway brought him breakfast on a tray, tutting over his condition and informing him that the entire town was talking about his heroics at the mine. "Never seen anything like it," she declared, plumping his pillows with unnecessary vigor. "Running into that inferno not once but 3 times. Miss Gardner was beside herself with worry, poor thing. Barely left your side until morning." This information warmed Zachary more than the hot coffee she had brought. "She shouldn't have troubled herself," he said, though he was glad she had. Mrs. Holloway fixed him with a knowing look. "That girl cares for you something fierce, Mr. Young. Anyone with eyes can see it." She paused at the door. "And if you don't mind my saying so, the feeling appears to be mutual." Before Zachary could formulate a response, she was gone, leaving him with her words echoing in his mind. Was it that obvious to everyone but themselves? Jenkins sent word that he should take the week to recover, and Dr. Wilson stopped by to check his lungs and change the bandages on his hands. By noon, Zachary was restless, the 4 walls of his room suddenly confining after weeks of active work. He dressed carefully, mindful of his injuries, and made his way downstairs just as Zara was entering the boarding house. "You should be resting," she exclaimed when she saw him. "I've rested enough," he replied, though in truth his chest still ached with each breath. "I thought I might walk to the general store, get some fresh air." Concern warred with understanding in her expression. "At least let me come with you," she said. "I have an hour before I need to be back at the office." They walked slowly, Zachary's normally easy stride hampered by the lingering weakness in his limbs. The town was still abuzz with talk of the mine fire, and several people stopped them to thank Zachary for his actions or to ask after his health. "You're something of a local hero now," Zara observed as they left the general store, where the proprietor had insisted on giving Zachary a pouch of tobacco free of charge. "Hardly," he demurred. "I just did what needed doing." She looked at him with a mixture of exasperation and fondness. "Will you ever accept praise for your good deeds?" "When I've earned it, perhaps," he replied, only half joking. They had reached the small park at the center of town, where a few benches offered rest in the shade of newly planted trees. Zachary sank onto one gratefully, his energy already flagging despite the short walk. "About yesterday," Zara began, sitting beside him. "Before the fire, we were talking about us," he nodded, suddenly nervous. "We were." She smoothed her skirt, a gesture he had come to recognize as a sign of her own nervousness. "I said some things last night while you were half asleep, things I'm not sure you remember." "I remember," he said quietly. "You said you cared for me." Color rose in her cheeks. I do." She took a deep breath. "But I need to know if those feelings are returned, Zach. Because if they're not, if you still see me as just someone you helped who now has her own path, then I need to stop," he interrupted gently. He turned to face her more fully, wincing slightly at the movement. "Zara, from the moment I saw you outside that saloon, something in me recognized something in you. I can't explain it better than that. It wasn't just about helping you or protecting you. It was about finding a piece of myself I thought was lost forever." Her eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise at his words. "These past weeks in Castle Dome," he continued, "watching you build a new life, seeing your strength and your kindness, it's made me want things I haven't let myself want in years. A home, a purpose, a future." He hesitated, then added softly, "Someone to share it all with." "Oh, Zach," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He reached for her hand, his bandaged fingers closing gently around hers. "I'm not good with words, Zara, and I come with more baggage than any woman should have to bear. But if you're asking if I care for you, the answer is yes. More than I thought possible." For a long moment, she simply looked at him, as if memorizing his face. Then, with deliberate care, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss so gentle it was almost reverent. Zachary remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this perfect moment. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes luminous with emotion. "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "You're always so careful, so reserved. I thought perhaps you saw me as a responsibility, nothing more." "Never that," he assured her. "Though I admit I've been cautious. Your life was in upheaval when we met. I didn't want to take advantage." She laughed softly, "Always the gentleman." "Not always," he corrected, thinking of how close he had come to truly hurting Thorne the day before. "But I try to be the man my father raised me to be." They sat in companionable silence for a while, hands still linked, each absorbing the significance of what had just passed between them. Around them, Castle Dome continued its daily rhythms. A wagon loaded with lumber creaked past. Children raced by in a game of tag. Shopkeepers called to one another across the street. "I should get back to the office," Zara said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "Peterson is lost without me. And I should return to the boarding house before Mrs. Holloway sends a search party," Zachary agreed, equally reluctant to end this moment. She stood finally, smoothing her skirt again. "Will you be all right getting back on your own?" He nodded, rising more carefully. "I'm not quite an invalid. Just stubborn," she teased, then grew serious again. "Zach, thank you for everything, but especially for today." "For what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "For being brave enough to say what was in your heart," she replied simply. "I know that wasn't easy for you." It hadn't been expressing emotions, had never come naturally to him. Even before the war had taught him the danger of attachment. But looking at Zara now, her face alight with happiness that he had caused, Zachary couldn't regret his momentary vulnerability. "Tonight," he said impulsively, "would you like to have supper at the hotel restaurant? A proper meal, just the two of us?" Her smile was radiant. "I'd like that very much." He watched her walk away, her step lighter than before, and felt a corresponding lightness in his own spirit. The future, which had for so long been an abstract concept, a distant horizon always receding before him, suddenly seemed immediate and full of promise. That evening, dressed in his best shirt and newly polished boots, Zachary escorted Zara to the Castle Dome Hotel, where the dining room offered the finest meal available in town. She had done something special with her hair, arranging it in a style that framed her face beautifully, and wore a dress of deep blue that he hadn't seen before. "New?" he asked, gesturing to the dress as they were shown to their table. She nodded, a touch self-consciously. "I saw it in the general store window last week. An extravagance, but—" She smiled. "I wanted to look nice for tonight." "You always look beautiful," he said simply, pulling out her chair. The meal was pleasant, if somewhat limited by frontier standards: beefsteak, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. But the quality of the food was secondary to the conversation. which flowed easily between them, ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future. "I'd like to study nursing properly," Zara confided over dessert. "Dr. Wilson says I have a natural aptitude for it, and with the town growing, there's real need." "You'd be wonderful at it," Zachary agreed. "I've seen how gentle you are with those in pain." He thought of her tending to his injuries after the mine fire. How patient and kind. She looked pleased at his assessment. "And you, will you stay with Jenkins at the livery?" "For now," he said. "Though eventually—" He hesitated, then continued carefully. "Eventually I'd like to have my own place again. A small ranch, perhaps. Nothing fancy, just enough land to raise a few horses, build a proper home." "That sounds lovely," she said softly, and something in her tone made his heart beat faster. As they left the hotel, the night air was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead in a way only possible far from city lights. They walked slowly back toward the boarding house, neither in a hurry to end the evening. "I've been thinking," Zachary said as they approached Mrs. Holloway's establishment, "about what you said yesterday, about what people might think of our arrangement." "Oh," Zara glanced at him curiously. "You were right that it's unusual," he continued. "Two unmarried people spending so much time together. It might give rise to talk, especially now that we're—" He gestured vaguely between them, uncertain how to categorize this new development in their relationship. "Courting," she supplied, a smile playing at her lips. "Yes," he agreed, relieved she had provided the word. "Courting." "And what do you propose we do about it?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes serious in the moonlight. Zachary stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I thought perhaps I should speak to Reverend Fletcher about publishing bans." Zara's breath caught. "Zach, are you proposing marriage?" He realized suddenly how abrupt this must seem, how lacking in romance or proper preparation. "I'm making a mess of this," he said ruefully. "I had planned. That is, I wanted to do this properly." With a ring and pretty words, and she placed a finger gently over his lips, stopping his rambling. "Zach," she said softly, "just ask me, simply and directly. That's all I need." He took her hands in his bandaged palms making the gesture awkward but no less sincere. "Zara Gardner, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her face radiant in the moonlight. "Yes, I will." He wanted to pull her into his arms then, to seal their agreement with a kiss. But they were standing in full view of the boarding house, where curtains occasionally twitched with the unmistakable sign of watchful eyes. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," he suggested, nodding toward the house. She laughed softly, understanding his meaning. "Yes, I think that would be wise, Mrs. Holloway was nowhere to be seen when they entered, though the lamp in the parlor was still lit, suggesting she wasn't far. They paused at the foot of the stairs, reluctant to part, despite the propriety that demanded they do so. "Good night, then," Zara said, her eyes telling a different story than her words. "Good night," Zachary replied, then added in a lower voice, "My future wife." The wonder in her smile was worth every mile he had traveled, every hardship he had endured to reach this moment. "My future husband," she whispered back, the words a promise and a benediction. As he watched her ascend the stairs, Zachary was struck by how completely his life had changed in the span of a few short weeks. From a solitary drifter with no fixed destination to a man with purpose, with connections, with love, it was a transformation he could never have anticipated when he first rode into Brimstone Creek and saw a woman begging beside a saloon. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Castle Dome, met with general approval and a few knowing smiles from those who had observed their growing closeness. Mrs. Holloway, in particular, was beside herself with excitement, offering to host a small reception after the ceremony, and already planning the menu in extensive detail. Reverend Fletcher agreed to publish the banns the following Sunday, with the wedding to take place 3 weeks hence, a compromise between proper observance of tradition and the couple's desire not to wait too long. In the meantime, there were preparations to be made. Zachary, at Jenkins' suggestion, began looking at a small property on the outskirts of town, a modest house with a barn and corral, sitting on 5 acres of decent grazing land. The previous owner, a widower, had returned east to live with his daughter, leaving the place in good repair but priced to sell quickly. "It's perfect for a young couple starting out," Jenkins said as they walked the property one afternoon. "Close enough to town for Zara's work, but with enough space for you to start breeding horses if you've a mind to." Zachary surveyed the land, seeing not what was there but what could be the corral expanded to accommodate more horses, a garden beside the house, perhaps even a small orchard in time. "I'll take it," he decided, "if Zara approves." He brought her to see it the next day, watching her face anxiously as she explored the 2-bedroom house with its stone fireplace and sturdy pine floors. "It needs curtains," she said finally, standing in what would be their bedroom. "And perhaps a coat of whitewash, but Zach, it's wonderful." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "It's a real home." "Our home," he corrected, relief washing through him at her approval. "If you're sure it's what you want." "It's more than I ever thought to have again," she assured him, crossing to take his hands. "A home, a husband, a future full of possibilities." She hesitated, then added softly, "Maybe even children someday, if you want that." The image her words conjured Zara with a child in her arms, their child filled him with unexpected longing. "I'd like that," he admitted. "Though I confess the idea of being a father terrifies me somewhat." She smiled, understanding in her eyes. "We'll learn together then, when the time is right." They sealed the deal on the house that same day, agreeing to take possession immediately after the wedding. In the evenings, they pored over catalogs from the general store, selecting modest furnishings to supplement the few pieces the previous owner had left behind. The 3 weeks of their engagement passed in a whirlwind of activity. Zara continued her work at the assay office while also preparing for their new home, while Zachary divided his time between the livery stable, fixing up the house, and occasional meetings with the bank manager about a small loan to purchase breeding stock. 2 days before the wedding, a letter arrived for Zachary, the return address showing it had come from Nashville, Tennessee. He opened it with a sense of trepidation, having sent inquiries to his old hometown weeks earlier, but unsure what response, if any, he would receive. The letter was from his father's former business partner, a man named Samuel Hadley, whom Zachary remembered as a frequent dinner guest in his childhood home. Hadley expressed surprise and pleasure at hearing from Zachary after so many years, having assumed him either dead or permanently settled elsewhere after the war. But it was the final paragraphs that caught Zachary's breath. Midnight Star, the filly he had raised, was indeed still alive, though elderly now at 22. More remarkably, her daughter, a black mare with the same distinctive white star marking, was in her prime at 7 years old, and currently for sale as Hadley was reducing his stock. "If you're serious about starting a breeding operation," Hadley wrote, "there could be no finer foundation mare than Star's legacy. The bloodline is impeccable, as you well know, and she has your father's gentle temperament combined with her grandsire's speed. Name your price, my boy. I'd rather see her with you than sold to strangers." Zachary read the letter twice, his heart racing at the unexpected connection to his past. To have a horse from his father's line, A direct descendant of Midnight Star, it was more than he had dared hope for when he'd written those tentative inquiries. He showed the letter to Zara that evening, watching her face as she read. "This is remarkable," she said when she had finished. "It's like a piece of your history returning to you. It would stretch our finances," he cautioned. "The mare wouldn't be cheap, and there'd be transportation costs to consider." She took his hand, her expression serious. "This is important, Zach, not just for the breeding operation, but for you. For your connection to your family, to who you were before the war." She squeezed his fingers gently. "We'll make it work. I'll take extra shifts at the assay office if needed." Her immediate support, her understanding of what this opportunity meant to him beyond the practical considerations, reinforced what Zachary already knew, that in Zara, he had found not just a wife but a true partner. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. The small church was filled to capacity, with what seemed like half the town in attendance, a testament to how quickly both Zachary and Zara had been accepted into the community of Castle Dome. Zachary stood at the altar beside Reverend Fletcher, his palms damp with nervousness despite the confidence he felt in his decision. Jenkins, serving as his best man, gave him an encouraging nod as the piano began to play and the congregation rose for the bride's entrance. Zara appeared in the doorway, a vision in a simple white dress adorned with lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on adding a veil, anchored with a coronet of wild roses that Emily Wilson had helped arrange that morning. She carried a small bouquet of the same roses, their delicate scent filling the air as she moved slowly up the aisle, her eyes fixed on Zachary's face. Time seemed to slow as she approached, each step bringing them closer to a future neither could have imagined just months before. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, Zachary felt a sense of rightness so profound it nearly took his breath away. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with clear conviction by both bride and groom. When Reverend Fletcher pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause, their genuine pleasure in the couple's happiness evident in every face. The reception at the boarding house afterward was a lively affair, with Mrs. Holloway outdoing herself on the refreshments, and someone producing a fiddle for dancing in the cleared parlor. Zachary, who had never been one for public displays, nevertheless found himself enjoying the celebration, particularly the way Zara's face glowed with joy as she moved from guest to guest, accepting congratulations and well wishes. "You've done well for yourself, Young," Jenkins said, clapping him on the shoulder. "She's a fine woman." "Better than I deserve," Zachary agreed, his gaze following his new wife as she laughed at something Emily Wilson had said. "Nonsense," Jenkins retorted. "You're a good man." "Prove that at the mine fire, if nothing else." He raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings." Zachary echoed the sentiment, though privately he thought it insufficient to describe what he felt. This wasn't merely a new beginning, it was a resurrection of hopes and dreams he had thought forever buried in the blood-soaked fields of Tennessee and Virginia. As the afternoon waned, the newlyweds slipped away from the celebration, boarding a rented buggy for the short journey to their new home. They had decided against a traditional wedding trip, preferring instead to invest the money in their property and start their life together immediately. The house welcomed them with the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the windows, highlighting the few personal touches Zachary had managed to add in the preceding days: a rocking chair by the fireplace, a quilt from Mrs. Holloway spread across their bed, a small bookshelf filled with the few volumes they owned between them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," Zachary said as he carried Zara across the threshold, a tradition she had insisted upon despite his protests that it was unnecessarily theatrical. "I like the sound of that," she replied, her arms around his neck, "both the Mrs. Young and the home part." He set her down gently, suddenly aware of the significance of this moment. They were truly alone together for the first time, husband and wife in their own home. The thought sent a mixture of desire and nervousness coursing through him. Zara seemed to sense his thoughts, a similar awareness reflected in her eyes. "I should change," she said softly. "This dress is lovely but hardly practical for an evening at home." Zachary nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "Make sure they're settled for the night." Outside, the autumn evening was cooling rapidly, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Zachary tended to the buggy horse and his own mare with methodical care, using the familiar tasks to calm his racing thoughts. By the time he returned to the house, twilight had fallen completely, and a warm glow emanated from the windows. Inside, Zara had lit several lamps and stoked the fire in the hearth. She had changed from her wedding dress into a simple nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She stood by the fire, looking simultaneously vulnerable and assured, a contradiction that Zachary found utterly captivating. "I made tea," she said, gesturing to 2 cups on the small table beside the rocking chair. It seemed appropriate somehow. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Zara," he began, uncertain how to express what he was feeling. "I want you to know that we don't have to, that is, if you're not ready." She silenced him with a gentle finger to his lips, a gesture that was becoming familiar between them. "Zach," she said softly, "I'm not afraid. Not of you, not of this." She moved closer, her body almost touching his. "I want to be your wife in every way." The last of his hesitation dissolved at her words. He gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that quickly deepened from gentle to passionate. She responded eagerly, her body molding against his with an instinctive grace that belied her relative inexperience. Later, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilt, the room illuminated only by the dying embers in the fireplace, Zachary marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter outside a saloon to this, a shared bed, a shared life, a shared future stretching before them like an open road. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked, her head pillowed on his chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns across his skin. "That I'm the luckiest man in the Arizona territory," he replied honestly. "That I don't deserve this happiness, but I'll spend every day trying to." She propped herself up on one elbow, her expression serious in the dim light. "You deserve everything good in this world, Zachary Young. And I intend to make sure you get it." He pulled her down for another kiss, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling between them. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "God help me, I love you more than I thought possible." "And I love you," she whispered back. "My rescuer, my partner, my husband." They fell asleep in each other's arms, the first night of many they would spend together in the home they were building, in the life they were creating, step by careful step. The months that followed were filled with the ordinary challenges and joys of building a life together. Zachary continued working at the livery while slowly developing their own property, adding another corral and improving the barn in preparation for the arrival of Star's legacy, who was being transported from Tennessee by a trusted handler Hadley had recommended. Zara divided her time between the assay office and Dr. Wilson's practice, where she had become indispensable enough that the doctor was actively encouraging her to pursue formal training as a nurse. In the evenings, they worked together on their home, planting a small kitchen garden, painting walls, making the modest house truly their own with each improvement. Castle Dome continued to prosper around them, the population swelling as the mine expanded operations and new businesses opened to serve the growing community. There was talk of a proper school building to replace the temporary structure, and even rumors of the railroad considering a spur line to connect the town to the main route through the territory. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the desert, and the news that Zara was expecting their first child, due in late autumn. The announcement was met with joy from their friends, and a mixture of excitement and terror from Zachary, who threw himself into preparing the second bedroom as a nursery with an intensity that made Zara laugh. "The baby won't care if the walls are perfectly straight," she teased as she watched him meticulously measuring for a crib he intended to build. "I care," he replied, though he smiled at her gentle mockery. "I want everything to be perfect for him, or her," he amended quickly. "It will be," she assured him, resting a hand on the slight swell of her abdomen. "Because he or she will be loved. That's what matters most." Star's legacy arrived in early summer, a magnificent black mare who indeed bore the same distinctive white marking as her dam. Zachary spent hours with her each day, re-establishing the training techniques his father had taught him, gradually building the trust that would form the foundation of his breeding program. "She has your father's eyes," Zara observed one evening as they stood at the corral, watching the mare graze in the last light of day. "I mean, she looks at you the way I imagine he must have, with that mixture of assessment and affection." Zachary glanced at his wife, surprised and touched by her perception. "He would have liked you," he said. "Both my parents would have. My mother especially would have appreciated your practical nature. And your brother." It was the first time she had asked specifically about William, though Zachary had mentioned him occasionally in passing. "William would have teased me mercilessly about how long it took me to propose," he said with a small smile. "But he would have welcomed you as a sister without hesitation. He was like that, generous-hearted, quick to include others in his circle." Zara leaned against him, her swelling belly pressed against his side. "I wish I could have known them," she said softly, "but I'm glad they live on in your memories, and in the stories you'll tell our child." The thought of sharing those stories, of passing on the legacy of his family to a new generation, filled Zachary with a profound sense of continuity. The circle was closing somehow. What had been broken by war and loss was being mended through love and new life. As autumn approached again, marking a year since their first meeting, preparations for the baby's arrival intensified. Dr. Wilson visited regularly to check on Zara's progress, pronouncing both mother and child healthy and strong. Friends and neighbors contributed handmade blankets, tiny clothes, and practical advice in equal measure. "Have you thought of names?" Emily Wilson asked during one of her visits, as she and Zara sorted through the growing collection of baby items. Zara exchanged a glance with Zachary, who was putting the finishing touches on the crib nearby. "We have a few ideas," she said. "Thomas, after my father if it's a boy, or perhaps William after Zach's brother." "And if it's a girl," Emily prompted. "Elizabeth," Zachary answered. "After my mother." The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and the baby grew increasingly active, kicking and shifting in ways that made Zara alternately laugh and grimace. Zachary found himself fascinated by these visible signs of the new life they had created, often placing his hand on her belly to feel the movements directly. "Active, like its father," Zara commented one night as a particularly energetic series of kicks kept her awake. "Always in motion." "Patient, like its mother," Zachary countered, rubbing gentle circles on her lower back where the strain of carrying the child caused her the most discomfort. "Waiting for the right moment." That moment came on a crisp October morning, almost exactly a year from the day they had first ridden into Castle Dome together. Zachary was in the barn when Zara called for him, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency that had him running to the house immediately. "It's time," she said simply when he burst through the door, finding her leaning against the table, one hand pressed to her back. "Dr. Wilson said to expect it to be a while yet, but I think you should fetch him now." Zachary hesitated, torn between not wanting to leave her and the need to summon help. "Are you sure? I could take you into town instead." "No," she said firmly. "I want to have our child here in our home." She managed a smile despite the discomfort evident in her posture. "Besides, I don't think riding in a buggy over those rutted roads would be particularly comfortable right now." He couldn't argue with that logic. "I'll go for the doctor, then come straight back," he promised, already reaching for his hat. "And I'll send word to Emily to come too." The ride into town was the fastest Zachary had ever made, his mare responding to his urgency with a speed that would have impressed even his father. Dr. Wilson, fortunately, was in his office and immediately gathered his supplies. Emily, alerted to the situation, promised to follow as soon as she had collected the additional items her father requested. By the time Zachary returned home with the doctor, Zara's labor had progressed noticeably. She had moved to their bedroom, where she alternated between pacing slowly and resting on the edge of the bed, her face flushed with exertion but her eyes clear and determined. "First babies often take their time," Dr. Wilson said reassuringly after examining her. "But everything looks normal." "You're doing very well, Mrs. Young." The hours that followed were among the most intense of Zachary's life, more challenging in some ways than even the worst battles he had experienced during the war. There, at least, he had been able to take action, to fight back against whatever threatened him. Here, he could only watch as Zara endured wave after wave of pain, offering what support he could but ultimately powerless to ease her struggle. Emily arrived as dusk was falling, bringing fresh water and clean linens. She took one look at Zachary's stricken face and gently suggested he might like to wait in the other room. "No," Zara said immediately, reaching for his hand. "I want him here, I need him here." And so he stayed, holding her hand, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement as the labor intensified. Outside, night fell completely, the room illuminated only by lamplight that cast long shadows on the walls. Time seemed to lose all meaning, marked only by the rhythm of Zara's contractions and the occasional quiet instructions from Dr. Wilson. Finally, near midnight, the doctor announced that it was time to push. Zachary moved to support Zara from behind, his arms providing a brace as she bore down with a strength that amazed him, her determination evident in every line of her body. "I can see the head," Dr. Wilson announced after several exhausting pushes. "One more good effort, Mrs. Young." Zara gathered her remaining strength, her hand clutching Zachary's with bruising force as she pushed once more. There was a moment of incredible tension, and then release, followed by the most miraculous sound Zachary had ever heard, the indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "A girl," Dr. Wilson announced, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Tears streamed down Zara's face as the doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest. "Elizabeth," she whispered, looking up at Zachary with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "Our daughter." Zachary couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife and child together. His family. The word echoed in his mind with a significance he had never fully appreciated until this moment. This was what he had been searching for in all those years of wandering not a place, but these people, this connection, this belonging. She has your eyes, Zara said softly as the baby quieted, gazing up at them with the unfocused but unmistakably blue eyes of a newborn. And your strength, Zachary replied, finding his voice at last. He reached out tentatively to touch the wispy dark hair that crowned his daughter's head. "Hello, Elizabeth," he murmured. "Welcome to the world." In the days that followed, they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, the midnight feedings, the constant vigilance, the overwhelming love that seemed to grow with each passing hour. Zachary discovered a patience he hadn't known he possessed, spending long nights walking the floor with his daughter cradled against his chest when she refused to settle for Zara. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, Mrs. Holloway with a basket of her famous apple pies, Jenkins with a hand-carved rocking horse for when she's a bit older, Emily Wilson with practical advice and offers to help whenever needed. The community that had welcomed them now embraced their child, expanding the circle of connection that Zachary had once thought forever closed to him. As winter settled over Castle Dome, bringing cool days and cold nights, the young household was a haven of warmth and contentment. They celebrated Christmas quietly, just the three of them, though they accepted an invitation to dinner at the Wilsons' the following day. Zachary had never been one for holiday sentimentality, but watching Zara place Elizabeth's tiny hand on a wrapped package, helping her open her first Christmas gift, he found himself unexpectedly moved by the simple joy of the moment. Spring brought new developments. Zara returned to work part-time at the doctor's office, bringing Elizabeth with her when Zachary was busy with the horses. The breeding program was showing promise, with Star's legacy due to foal in late summer, and several local ranchers expressing interest in the bloodline. And the town continued to grow, the long-rumored railroad spur finally confirmed as surveyors arrived to map the route. "We made the right choice coming here," Zara observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and gold. Elizabeth, now 6 months old, slept peacefully in her mother's arms, her dark lashes resting against plump cheeks. "We did," Zachary agreed, his gaze moving from the landscape to his wife and daughter. "Though I suspect we would have found our way eventually, regardless of where we settled." She looked at him curiously. "What makes you say that?" "Because some things are meant to be," he said simply. "Not by fate or divine intervention, but by the choices we make, the paths we choose, the courage we find to reach for what we truly want." He took her free hand in his, stroking his thumb across her knuckles. "I spent years drifting, Zara, but I was always moving toward you, even when I didn't know it." Her eyes softened with emotion. "And I was waiting, even when I had no hope left." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the first stars appearing overhead. Elizabeth stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny hand curling around a lock of her mother's hair. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the desert, wild and free, yet somehow comforting in its familiarity. "You ever think about that night in Brimstone Creek?" Zara asked softly. "How different everything might have been if you hadn't stopped, if you'd just ridden past the saloon without looking back?" Zachary considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember how you looked at me when I asked your name. How, even in the depths of despair, there was a light in you that refused to be extinguished." He smiled at the memory. "I think I fell in love with you in that moment, though it took me months to admit it to myself. And I thought you were either a fool or an angel," she said with a small laugh. "Offering help to a stranger with no expectation of return." "Neither fool nor angel," he corrected. "Just a man who recognized something worth saving." "We saved each other," Zara said, looking down at their sleeping daughter, and in doing so made something beautiful. As the night deepened around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, Zachary felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for most of his adult life. The wounds of the past would never fully heal the memories of war, the losses he had endured, but they no longer defined him. Instead, he was defined by this moment, by the love he felt for the woman beside him and the child they had created together. The future stretched before them, unknown but full of promise. There would be challenges. Certainly life in the territories was never easy, but they would face them together, with the strength they had found in each other and the community they had helped to build. And it had all begun with a simple gesture and a question. A cowboy, removing his hat, asking a woman's name outside a saloon in a dusty frontier town. The smallest actions, Zachary reflected, could lead to the greatest changes, a truth he would carry with him for all the days of his life.